Welcome to the She's Bold podcast. I'm Beth Whitman. Hello. Yep, I've been away from the podcast for the past couple of weeks. Frankly, with everything that's been going on, I haven't known what to say. I've been following the news closely, and I just needed to take a pause and to take some time to reflect on everything that's been going on. But I'm back. Regular listeners know that I normally bring you one-on-one in-person conversations with fascinating and bold women. I've had to take a break from these in-person conversations due to the pandemic, but I'm somewhat hopeful that I'll be able to resume those relatively soon as restrictions here in Washington state start to lift. And as I sort out ways in which I can record in a safe environment, even if that means recording outside on my deck with 6 feet between me and my guest, which might just work out. Today's conversation was recorded in person, but it was almost 4 months ago. It was at the end of February, and it was one of my last in-person conversations that I had for the podcast. Now, under most circumstances, 4 months would feel like yesterday, but so much has happened since then that it really feels like eons ago. This conversation is with author and Holocaust survivor Laureen Nussbaum. Now, I was all ready to publish this episode in early March, but then things just started to shut down, at least here in Seattle. And as I re-listened to the conversation during the editing process, Laureen's description of not being allowed to go outside when she was growing up as a Jewish person, it just hit too close to home for me, for very different reasons, obviously, but I understood that feeling of not being allowed out. And really, a few months ago, we were all getting used to having our freedoms restricted. It was a new concept for us. Now we're, for the most part, used to it. So to hear someone describe how it was happening to her was really difficult for me, as I suspect it might have been for listeners. So it just didn't feel like the time was right for me to release the episode at that point. Now, with the murder of George Floyd and the spotlight on so many other people of color who've been killed in similarly tragic ways, Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin, Manuel Ellis here in Washington state, as well as other murders such as Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, whose killers are only now, months later, being charged. I felt like this was a good time to finally get this episode out. Because I think there's some relevant content here. This conversation highlights what happened to Laureen growing up Jewish in the early years of Hitler's regime. So she knows quite well what systematic racism feels like. By and large, this is Laureen's story. We talk about her family's escape from Germany and their time in Amsterdam, and that includes their ties with Anne Frank and her family. But we also talk about her new book, Shedding Our Stars, the story of Hans Kallmeyer and how he saved thousands of families like mine. Hans Kallmeyer, by the way, is credited with saving more Jewish people than Schindler, and it's believed he saved about 3,700 people. In this conversation, there's hope and there's optimism. It's a reminder that even as we move through terrible times, be it a pandemic or unimaginable injustices thrust upon people of color or other marginalized segments of our population, even with all that, there's hope. There is a ray of hope because there are things we can do to stand up against injustices in both large and small ways. We can help by simply speaking up. We can help those around us. You'll hear Laureen talk at the very end of our conversation about our need to protest. And I'm sure that when we spoke 4 months ago, I don't think she actually imagined that this would come to fruition, that the protests that are going on today would actually happen. But I believe this is the kind of response that she had in mind, minus the violence, of course. Now, one quick word before we get to that episode. If you do enjoy the show and would like to show your support, you can do so with a donation through Patreon. You'll have access to bonus content and have the ability to ask questions of guests. And I will tell you that the support that I receive from this small but mighty community on Patreon is invaluable to me. These folks are stepping up and telling me that the mission of the show is important to them. They understand the value of bringing these conversations to light, especially at a time when we are feeling so much darkness around us. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/bebold. And if you'd prefer to make a one-time donation, you can do that too via Venmo or PayPal. And that information is all on the Patreon page. Thank you so much to my Patreon supporters. And if you're thinking about it, please head on over to patreon.com/bebold and just let me know in a small monetary way that you enjoy this. Okay, with that, please enjoy this conversation with Laureen Nussbaum. You had mentioned that you have lived here for 8 years?
Yeah, exactly.
Is that right?
8 years last week.
Were you in Seattle at that time? Or
No, I moved from Portland.
Moved from Portland, yeah.
My husband died in July of 2011, and I did not want to stay in our condo. We were planning to come to Seattle. We had already made some plans to move and had looked at different places where we might want to move. And so I accelerated the process and moved here in February of 2012.
Are you enjoying it?
Oh, yes.
Do you like Seattle?
Yeah.
This is a really great place here. This is...
It's a wonderful place. It's really, it's pricey.
It's really it's a community center, you know, and I mean, really, there's very much a community feel.
Oh yeah,
to it.
I have the feeling they are more or less my sisters and brothers. You know, it's very comfortable.
Yeah, that's great. So I feel like maybe the best way to start this conversation, if you don't mind, would be to really just go back in time and hear your history. And then if you don't mind, then I will kind of interject with some questions.
Okay.
Because I'm sure that there's some details there that...
You mean from the very beginning?
Well, yes, actually I do. No. And don't worry about time either. As long as you don't have a time constraint, I don't mind the stories. And I think because you were so young in terms of what really important events happened to you and during that time, we do kind of have to go back.
Yeah, okay. Sure.
Go back away.
Yeah,
so if you would just start.
So I was born in Frankfurt, the same city where Anne Frank was born, by the way. And when I was 8 years old, my parents had decided that we needed to leave Germany. So we moved to Amsterdam in the Netherlands.
And you left for what reason?
Because we considered ourselves a Jewish family. Although we were not very traditional, and although I had a Roman Catholic grandmother and loved to go to Mass with her, we still considered ourselves a Jewish family. And as Jews were being marginalized in Germany, life became less and less pleasant. It became quite unpleasant. Mm-hmm. For instance, by the time I was ready for third grade, my older sister and I and all the other Jewish kids could no longer go to public schools. We had to go to, well, they were public, but they were for Jewish children only.
What were they doing? What kind of feeling did you get that it just made you uncomfortable or unwelcome?
Well, you were being segregated out. You know, you were marginalized. And you felt this quite clearly. One girl with whom I used to go to school, we shared the same way to school walking, didn't want to walk with me anymore. Simply, you didn't belong anymore, but you thought you were part of the society, and all of a sudden, you were not anymore. And so, as opportunities to make a living diminished and Jews felt discriminated against, they tried, if they could, to leave the country. And that's what my father decided.
And how old were you then?
I was 8.
8, okay.
Yeah. So I finished third grade in Germany because the schools at the time went from Easter to Easter rather than from fall to July. And so I finished third grade in Frankfurt and then in the Netherlands picked up fourth grade in September. So I didn't lose any time, which was maybe the first manifestation of my independence because we went to a transition school in Amsterdam. It was housed in the public schools where the German-speaking kids were taught the Dutch language and the Dutch geography, maybe a little bit of history, but mainly language. And we also worked our way through arithmetic books and so on. And the director of this transition school was very adamant that his pupils would be placed one grade back so that they would do well, which would reflect positively on his transition school. Well, I was not about to allow this to happen because I noticed that I had caught up with a boy who was going to go to 4th grade. And I said, I'm ready for 4th grade. And my parents, who didn't speak the language and who were, like all good Germans, they believed in authority, so they didn't quite know how to handle this. So they said to me, if you insist on going to 4th grade, you'll have to do it on your own, which I did. I went to the principal, small school, just 6 grades, that's all. I mean, one class for each grade. And I told him that I thought I was ready to go to 4th grade. And a tall man, I still see us at the landing of the staircase. And he said, now, you know what? You start 3rd grade, and if it's too easy, then we can always promote you to 4th grade. And I said, that's not very logical. And I know I used the word logical. I think it's much better I start in 4th grade, and if I can't hack it, then I can always drop down.
Where did you get that gumption?
I don't know. I was always the oldest boy in the family. I had an older sister and a younger sister. I was the boy, and I was always the one who took responsibility for everybody and for everything. So I just felt this was ridiculous. This boy who had been in my same school in Frankfurt, but one grade ahead of me. I had caught up with him, not because I was so ambitious, but because it was easy for me. I could do it. And so why should he go to 4th grade and I should go to 3rd grade just to please the director of the transitional school? So I went to 4th grade. I didn't get all A's by any means, but I did.
At least it was a challenge for you.
Well, and I could follow very easily, and before long I was a good student. I was never, an all A student, but was a good student, so no problem, really. It was the first time that I manifested my independence. Really.
Well, and what's interesting about that is that your mother didn't tell you no, that you couldn't do it, which might have been the case, especially if you were already feeling, if the family was already feeling a little marginalized.
Yeah.
Your mother could have said, don't make waves, just do as you're told. Yeah. But instead, she was supportive of you.
She just let me be.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I mean, and that fosters independence, right?
Well, that's good. On the other hand, I think they miserably failed my older sister, who was actually placed 2 grades back. She was 3 years older than I, and she was a goody-goody. She did what she was told. And so ever since, although we have 3 years of age difference, I was right on her heels. She was in 5th grade and I was in 4th grade, and that was terrible for her. I think she never quite overcame that, really. So I don't think my parents were very astute.
Well, I think that's hard to predict as well. I think that would have been a hard thing for anyone to predict the outcome of your older sister in terms of that. So you're in school in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. And how long were you there?
Well, we stayed there all through the war. My husband and my children and I emigrated to the United States in 1957. So
at that point, were you also segregated, or no? That was was completely integrated.
Oh no! In the Netherlands, particularly in Amsterdam, the population was very mixed. There was about 30% Protestant, 30% Roman Catholic, 30% who had no religion, which was perfectly acceptable, and about 10% Jews, and it all, in a way, mixed, and in other ways stayed separate. They had a kind of, they called it the pillars of society. There was a Protestant pillar with a Protestant radio, Protestant newspaper, Catholic, blah, blah, blah. And so, but we coexisted and we respected each other. And of course, life in the Netherlands for us children was wonderful because we could go everywhere on our bicycles, and we never had a car, my family. And so we were free to do things that we enjoyed.
Which had been quite different than when you were in Frankfurt, is that
in
right?
Frankfurt, we didn't have bicycles and we were dependent on public transportation, so we didn't. And my mother had much more help in the household, so we were taken places. Here we went places.
Right. So what changed at that time? I know the Nazis had come in and occupied Amsterdam.
What changed first, which I always emphasize when I talk to youngsters, is that because we, my sisters and I, of course, learned the Dutch language much faster than our parents, which is only natural. Kids always learn fast. The whole dynamics of the family changed because we learned the language, and we told my mother, for instance, she had learned things from the cleaning woman, which we knew was not proper Dutch. So we told her, you can't say that. And I thought this was wonderful. This was so democratizing, you know. Not that my parents were very authoritarian, but there was still this expectation that parents know best. No, we knew best, you know. I relished that.
So that's another kind of feather in your cap of independence, right?
I think so. I really consciously felt this was important. But I also... it wasn't just that I felt I could lord it over my parents, but it was also that I felt a certain responsibility. I think it came together, you know, a rather early sense of feeling responsible that things would go well. And then, of course, we did not know enough history, but we all knew that the Netherlands had been neutral during World War I, that the Kaiser never invaded the Netherlands, and we just hoped that whenever Hitler gets into mischief, which we felt was coming. I mean, Germany was arming just to a tremendous extent. So if we thought, well, okay, so he will go to war, but not to the Netherlands. The Netherlands will be neutral like Switzerland. And that didn't work out. So in May of 1940, the Germans invaded the Netherlands. And ever since, we were in an occupied country, which is no fun. Yeah. Now, there was a difference between the Netherlands and, say, Denmark or Belgium or France. The Germans put in a civilian regime in the Netherlands because they intended, after they would win the war, which they were sure they would win, to annex the Netherlands, to make the Netherlands part of Germany. So we were already being eased into the German Reich. And that made a tremendous difference because the military occupation in France and Belgium, although it was harsh, was still very different from a civilian one. The military, by and large, followed orders from Berlin, but they were not as keen on eradicating all the Jews as the civilian government in the Netherlands was. We got very soon the same kind of restrictions that we had just escaped in Germany. Had to go to Jewish schools, and the whole rigmarole. Couldn't go to movies, to parks, to the beach, to concerts, to museums.
How many years did you have that freedom before?
From 1936 till 1940-41.
Okay, so 4 or 5
years.
Yeah, 4 or 5 years.
I think we only felt the pinch starting in 1941, so 5 years, I would say.
How did you react to that?
With great fear, because we knew that how horrible it was. My father had a close friend who had been arrested during Kristallnacht in November of 1938, and he and his wife came through the Netherlands on their way to the United States. Although he had promised not to talk about it, I know he talked to my father, and he didn't talk to me, but just seeing him after a few years, how he had, aged and how haggard he looked. We know, yeah.
At that time and at that age, how, like at 8 years old, and you're leaving your home country, did you have a sense of what was happening around you at that time?
Sure, very much so. Yeah, very much so, yes. Yeah. But I was lucky, again, in comparison to my older sister. My older sister, when we left Germany, was almost 12, and she had a close-knit circle of friends, girlfriends, who scattered all over the world. I was too young to have, I had one friend who went to South Africa, but it was not the kind of closeness that preteens have, So I didn't feel like my roots were torn off. It was much harder for her.
Yeah. So at that point, people were scattering. They were fleeing Germany to escape for their lives, literally. Were the concentration camps, and I'm sorry that I'm ignorant about this part of history, but
the first thing we knew about concentration camps, I knew, was in 1938 after Kristallnacht.
Okay.
There might have been before, but I was not aware of them.
Okay, so the feeling of fleeing, the need to flee, didn't come from actually knowing what was going on or what was to come, but it was just that this is getting unpleasant.
Well, life was getting more and more impossible, because you were cut off out of all kinds of professions. I mean, teachers couldn't teach in public schools anymore. Lawyers couldn't have law offices except only for Jewish clients. I mean, you were completely segregated out. And you couldn't go to concerts, you couldn't participate in anything cultural, which was important to my family. So.
Right. And then in 1941 or so,
The same thing
1942,
repeat. It was just a repeat performance.
you got that. And here you are older
Yeah.
now, and so you're probably feeling it even more.
Oh, yeah,
So
yeah.
you're just more conscious of it.
Sure, and then the war had broken out, and my parents, particularly my mother, who was a teenager during World War I, had told us enough about the horrors of war that we just knew it was terrible. She survived it in Vienna at the time, and so we knew about starvation and about ration boxes and a lack of food and all that. Yeah.
Would you talk about how your family did survive through that?
Well, sure, we did survive. I already mentioned that my mother's mother was not Jewish. And actually, maybe I should backtrack and talk briefly about my husband, because we were four of us, my older sister and my future husband, but I didn't know, a boyfriend, and his friend, and I went camping together in the summer of 1940. I was by far the youngest one, but I was always a little bit ahead, it seems. So the four of us went camping, and that was really wonderful. Camping was not with tents, but we had a hayloft where we slept, put a curtain between the boys' compartment and the girls' compartment. It was all very innocent. I mean, there was no hanky-panky. But it was quite clear that Rudy and I were very much attracted to each other. And Rudy's parents, the father was a pharmacist, and the mother didn't have a profession. My mother didn't have a profession either. Rudy's mother said to my mother, if I had a non-Jewish mother, I would do something to prove that my father wasn't Jewish either. So she sort of planted the bug in my mother's head. Mm-hmm. And indeed, my mother and my grandmother set about to try to prove that my mother's father, also Mr. Blumenthal, her maiden name was Blumenthal, was definitely Jewish, but to do some subterfuge, let's call it that way, to prove that he was not her father, which was relatively easy, believe me, because my grandfather's Jewish mother did not allow her son to marry a non-Jewish wife. Bless her bigotry, because it saved our lives. Mm. So my grandmother, my non-Jewish grandmother, and my Jewish grandfather only got married after his mother had died. By that time, my mother was 19 or 20. And so my mother was a legitimate child. And so it was relatively easy to say, well, Mr. Blumenthal married her mother. And he said it was her.
But who knows who the father was?
Who knows who the father was, yes. And now comes in the hero of my book, Hans Kallmeyer, who worked at the German main offices of the Reichskommissar in The Hague, who had a task to ferret out and decide on cases where people claimed they were not as Jewish as their papers read. And so my mother and grandmother petitioned and had all kinds of paperwork. For instance, my mother's report cards where it said quite clearly that she was Mia Alscher, not Blumenthal, and she went to school in Dresden. She lived in a foster family. All true, all very true. And so my grandmother and her sister swore false oath that the foster father in the family where my mother lived was the actual physical father of my mother. And that way we sort of evaded
so
being deported, and we could take our stars off. That's what my book is called, Shedding Our Stars.
So Shedding Our Stars, a story of Hans Kallmeyer and how he saved thousands of families like mine. That's your book. When did that come out?
Last October.
Great.
October
okay, so
2019.
Excellent.
Yeah. It's still warm from the bakery.
Yeah, it sure is. Yeah. So let's talk about Hans for a few minutes, just for listeners to get that little bit of background. Many people know Schindler, know the name Schindler and what he did to save the Jewish people. And I think that story probably happened many times over, that kind of story, but they just don't get told. And here you are telling the story of Hans Kallmeyer.
I want to tell this story because, number one, Kallmeyer saved more people than Schindler did. And number two, he did it in a particularly subtle way, because outwardly he would go see Hitler like everybody else had to, but he was never a party member. And he played the loyal German by doing what he could to save as many lives as he could. And I thought this is quite special.
He had control over, he was in an office that actually oversaw kind of the iffy cases. We're not sure if they're Jewish, but they might be Jewish, they may not be Jewish.
Yeah, well, his office had to decide dubious cases. That was the assignment.
Right. And so your family came through and you were able to show through paperwork that it was a dubious case indeed.
Yeah. Our case was relatively cut and dry for him because, he was not even interested, it shows in the papers that he wrote, whether my mother's foster father was her real father. He said it didn't matter. Her mother was non-Jewish, and who am I to say that the father was Jewish? He took it upon himself, I thought that was the most important point, that his office would have to disprove if somebody made a claim, rather than that the claimant would have to prove that.
Right.
And that made a tremendous difference.
Do you know how many people he saved?
Well, it's still not quite decided, but 3,700 is a very safe bet, probably more.
Mm-hmm. And Schindler, do you know?
A little over 1,000.
Okay. Yeah. Still, commendable. But I can understand your eagerness to get Hans's story out there too, because I think it's so important. And do you feel like there were many other men like these two who were also saving the Jews?
I don't know how many there were and what people could do, but there are accounts of I forget who it was now, in a concentration camp, somebody who survived, who said he survived because there was a German woman in the kitchen who gave him an onion or little food. There were people in a very small way who helped, who were humane and helped.
During that time, you had mentioned earlier that Anne Frank was from Frankfurt. Yeah. Also, and her family, as I understand it, also landed in Amsterdam.
They were earlier than we. They came as early as the fall of 1933. Yeah, very early.
Right, and your families were friends.
Yes.
What was that relationship like?
Well, in the German language in particular, in Dutch too, we make a difference between friends and acquaintances. So I would say we were acquaintances, they were not close friends. But they saw each other a few times a year.
Now we call it Facebook friends.
Yeah, okay. So I have a hunch, although I cannot really recall anything concrete, that Mr. Frank, who had already established his business, was probably helpful to my father in what needed to be done to establish a business in the Netherlands. Because my father had not been an independent businessman in Frankfurt. He had worked for a big firm as the financial expert, and he had to start something on his own in order to make a living in the Netherlands. And Mr. Frank had done the same a few years before. So I'm pretty sure that he helped.
Mm-hmm. And did he help your family actually get to Amsterdam?
No,
That
wasn't necessary.
Okay.
No.
That was an easy process.
No. There was, at that point in 1936, was still relatively easy, provided that you could afford it. And we could still take our furniture and most of our belongings. Also, I think financial. We could take it. My parents could take whatever money they had saved. It became more and more restrictive as the years went on. So people who only came in 1938 or so were in a much worse position than we were.
How did you actually physically make the move? You said you brought your furniture.
Oh, there was a big van. A van. Sure. And my parents went ahead in April of 1936, and my grandmother took the three of us on the train. And the last person whom we said goodbye to, who came to the station, was Alice Noy, my mother's best friend, who became Mrs. Koppel, the mother of Ted Koppel. She was a very close friend of the family.
Oh, interesting.
So, that's why Ted Koppel wrote the foreword for my book.
Oh,
because I've known him since he was a little boy.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Oh, wow. Such a small world, right? Huh. So you're in Amsterdam, and then the war starts, and things are changing quite a bit. Like, how did that change for you in your school system, in your schooling? Did you continue to go to school?
The same thing that happened to us in Germany happened again in the Netherlands. In the fall of 1941, we couldn't go to general school anymore. We had to go to Jewish schools. And the first year was still, that's the year that Anne Frank writes about, because she at that time was a 7th grader, I was a 9th grader. School was as normal as possible in the beginning. But pretty soon we could not ride public transportation anymore. We had to hand in our bicycles, so we had to walk 3/4 of an hour to get to school. And then once in the...
But the purpose of that was just to make things more difficult for you. Is that right?
No, to segregate us out.
Well, when you say that you couldn't have a bicycle, what's the purpose of taking someone's bicycle away?
Well, the Germans could use them all right.
I see. So I see. Okay.
They enriched themselves in all kinds of ways. And also by making us more helpless and more pitiful, just like...
More dependent.
Like the homeless here, you pity them, but they're not one of us. They're different. I mean, that's the general attitude,
So in terms of your school, kind of what changed?
Yeah, my ninth grade then was still relatively normal. But the big transportations, the deportations, started in July of 1942. That's when Margot Frank got her call to report for labor. That's when the Frank family went into hiding.
So Margot being the older one, a couple of years older than you.
A year and a half older than I am. So, and my older sister got the same call also. 7,000 young people, all refugees, got a call to report for labor.
So your sister went? Yes?
No.
She got called, you said?
She got the same call as Margot Frank did. I didn't get the call. I was not quite 15, and didn't. My younger sister didn't.
I see, okay.
You had to be over 15, and I think from 16 to 40 or 45, I'm not quite sure. So that's when the Frank family went into hiding. My family, by that time, already had a petition going to have our status revised so that my mother would be not Jewish. And so my older sister got a deferment. Deferment was the name of the game. You try to get a deferment for all kinds of things. But she got a deferment because our case was pending. So she didn't have to go. And as of the summer of 1942, things deteriorated rapidly. By December of 1942, that's just half a year, 40,000 Jews had been deported from the Netherlands. So, I mean, it was...
Just from the Netherlands, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And from the Netherlands, many, many more than from France or Belgium, for instance. And that was partly because of the different kind of government we had, as I mentioned before. Partly also because the Dutch registry was superb. Even better than the Germans. The Dutch don't really like it. They like to say that the Germans are so meticulous. The Dutch are too. And the Germans had an easy time to ferret out whatever they wanted.
Imagining what it must have been like for you. Was it completely frightening, or was it just a new norm?
Oh, it was frightening. I mean, we did not know about gas chambers. We knew about concentration camps. And we knew that nobody ever heard from anybody who had... been shipped off from Westerbork, which was our transition camp, to the east. We always talked about camps in the east, and I think we knew the name Auschwitz, but we didn't know what it...
Right, didn't know what was going on.
Yeah, no.
How did your family interact during that time?
Well, we tried...
What was a day like? Did you sit down and you had dinner? Did you talk about this, or did you feel like you couldn't talk at all?
Oh, yeah, we talked about it. Oh, well, of course, the most important talk was always who has disappeared again. I mean, you went to school, and I'm talking fall 1942. Maybe in the fall when the school started, you might have been 12. The next day, there were only 10 in your class, And where were the other two? Either deported or in hiding. We didn't know, and nobody asked any questions because you didn't want to know. You did not want to know that somebody was hiding because you could always be questioned and tortured. And so this became the new norm, Let's see how many are left. My older sister, who was 1 grade ahead of me, as I mentioned before, by January of 1940, no, before that already, December of 1942, she was the only student left in 11th grade. Can you imagine? Every day less and less. In my 10th grade, we were 5 or 6.
So you stayed in the Jewish school, even though technically you had petitioned that you weren't
Yeah,
Jewish.
we couldn't do anything else. We were wearing the star. We had to go to Jewish school. So we went there till we got...
Because it was still pending at that point?
Yeah.
Okay.
The decision was only made in January of 1943. And then we could shed our stars, my mother and my sisters and I, and then we went back to the regular schools.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did the Jewish schools stay open then? Because the younger...
It dwindled into nothingness. By the end of the school year of 1943, 2:43. There was nobody left. So that was the end of it.
How do you think that experience then went on to shape your life?
Oh, that's very difficult to say. It was.
I mean, you don't seem bitter. You don't seem angry. You're a beautiful, lovely, productive member of society. You're still very active.
Yes, I think what it did for me was to tell me to be alert and to respond to this, what I always feel like a call from the people who were less fortunate than I. Do your best that it will never happen again. So be active, be aware, and do what you can, and have been trying to a certain extent to do that. Also, of course, these years were very important because my boyfriend's parents were picked up in the fall of 1942.
And that's Rudy.
That's Rudy,
your husband later. Uh-huh.
Yeah. And I always knew where he was hiding. So I had a very definite duty to keep in touch with him and to do what I can to ameliorate his life.
Were you afraid of being caught because you were kind of a liaison?
I in May of 1942, I blissfully took off my star, went on the train and visited him. By August, I didn't dare to do that anymore. It was too dangerous. There were too many cases of people caught, and so I did not visit them anymore. He came to hide closer to Amsterdam, and we did meet at night in the winter. The nights are long, the days are short, so we could meet halfway between his hiding place and where I lived, and we would walk up and down and talk, and I would bring him some goodies if I had them.
And you said winter because the nights were longer and it was easier.
Terribly, that was terribly
that's
important.
Interesting.
Yes.
Huh.
And the moment I could take off my star, then I could go and visit him, and I got very friendly with the people where he was hiding, and they accepted me as, as belonging to Rudy, so to speak. So I'm now talking about 1943, and he stayed there till September of 1943 with the same family. I'm still in touch with a granddaughter and a great-granddaughter of those people where he was hiding.
How did he ultimately end up freeing himself?
What happened then was one very traumatic thing happened to him. His mother, who was the one that had whispered to my mother, I would prove that I'm not Jewish if I were in your shoes. She got herself a permit to come from the transition camp Westerbork to Amsterdam to buy medication for the pharmacy in the camp. The camp Westerbork still had a hospital or infirmary and a pharmacy, and Mr. Nussbaum was the pharmacist. And as long as the hospital was there, the Nussbaums were covered, they could stay. They had a stamp of a deferment, I mentioned those. And so she got, somehow she finagled it that she was permitted to go to Amsterdam for 2 days to buy a medication for the pharmacy. And she linked up with Rudy, of course. And that was very traumatic because she saw how pale he was. I mean, here he was 1943 now, so he would have been 21. Pale and, had been inside all the time. And she saw the youngsters at the camp who played volleyball and soccer, and she felt it was much healthier life. Wouldn't he come to the camp? She also, of course, wanted him closer by. And he said, no way. No way. And he would have liked his mother to go into hiding, but she couldn't do that because then her husband would be shipped off. So it was a very dramatic situation. She couldn't help him, he couldn't help her, and it was traumatic. And so after that, Rudy felt extremely stir-crazy and talked to the people where he was hiding, and they got him in touch with the underground, and he got falsified papers. The Dutch were superb in falsifying papers. I don't know about the Dutch printing press, but Elsevier is a very world-famous printing press. They are just excellent printers, and so they were superb in falsifying papers. So he got false papers. He had papers with his false ID card saying that he was purchasing vital parts for the German submarine. He got a travel permit, and he traveled all the way to the French-Spanish border on false papers with the idea that the French Marquis would help him across. which didn't work out. The link was broken, somebody had been arrested, and he found himself in southern France, speaking just a little bit of school French, but nothing that would sound remotely like the local people would speak, And so he had to do something. He filled out another set of papers, blank papers, and came back to Amsterdam, which was quite. I expand on this in my book because it's a really fantastic story. And so then he did never go into hiding the same way as before, as Anne Frank did, and so many others. He was semi above ground. His false papers were so good that he just could.
He kind of blended in.
Yeah, well, he blended in, and he found room and board. I think it was room and board. Yeah, with a family of Dutch marechaussee. That would be Dutch Federal Police. I think would be the translation. Who didn't know he was Jewish? They didn't ask, and he didn't tell. So they could if anything had happened, they could have said we had no idea.
Right. They could have
which
been
was,
honest. Yeah.
And so he was halfway above ground then, and that was a much better situation for him.
And then you got to see him at that point?
Oh, I got to see him from the moment I got rid of my star. I got to see him. And then I guess I went out twice a week or so to see him.
Well, that's a happy ending story, because if he had left, you may not have seen him after that.
That's so, of course. On the other side, I was not happy when he came back after a week, because I was 16 and really, in a way, breathing a sigh of relief that I now could be just a schoolgirl, because, at the transition from being...
Because you were not a caretaker, but you were...
Well, no, it was also the transition from big brother, little sister to... two teenagers.
Oh, I see, yeah.
Had its own problems, obviously. And I thought, if I just have 1 or 2 years to grow up, I would feel so much happier. But here he was, and utterly dependent on my being there, being his soulmate. So I made the best of it, but it was not easy. I found it very challenging.
It sounds like you were very aware and very mature for your age. I don't think I had those thoughts at 14, 15, 16.
Well, I guess the times made me.
Do you think it was the
out
times?
of necessity? I think so. Yeah.
I mean, to me, you showed independence at a very early age, which I don't think I had at 8 years old.
Well, I think I mentioned before, taking responsibility is sort of built into my DNA. I don't know, and so I also, my parents let me be because they knew I was responsible. Udi was very responsible. But they had to trust us, to not get into mischief and produce babies and things like that, So I felt always it was upon us, upon me to do the right thing, whatever the right thing was.
I think, not to take away from your story at all, but I bet listeners are interested in kind of the Anne Frank connection there, because it is interesting and it's a name that we all know.
It's our icon.
Yeah, it is. It is. She is so iconic in that way. What was that relationship while you were in Amsterdam?
Well, that was while we were in Amsterdam and they were gone. They were just among the many that were gone. There was nothing at all that made me think particularly of Anne Frank. I mean, my classmates were gone, and I remember, for instance, when I was back in the general school, at 10th grade, we had a 3 days retreat, and we slept in bunk beds and had a wonderful time. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, I started crying. I hadn't cried much. I'm not a big crier, because I was thinking of my Jewish classmates who were also in bunk beds, but not for the fun. And it was just two different worlds, But no, we didn't know about the Franks till after the war. Otto Frank came back early June, I think, of 1945.
And was his family? His family was already.
I was just going to tell you, he knew that his wife had died, Edith had died, but his 2 daughters were shipped back from Auschwitz westward. And they ended up in Bergen-Belsen. And Bergen-Belsen was a horrible camp, but they did not have gas chambers. So it was not a killing machine, so to speak. So he was very confident they would have survived. And
so you knew that much at that point?
When he came back.
Well, but I mean, you knew kind of where the gas chambers were?
No, only after the war.
After, okay.
Only after the war.
See.
No. As people came back. Well, Rudi's cousin Ilse came back from Theresienstadt. Lost her, both parents were shipped off. Her father had been what is that, the English word for that? a veteran of World War One who had been wounded in World War One as a German officer. So they were treated a little better for a while, and then her parents were shipped off from Theresienstadt or Terezin to Auschwitz, but Ilse somehow was left behind. So she survived heavily traumatized for the rest of her life. And then Otto Frank came back from Auschwitz via Odessa and Marseille through France as soon as the trains were riding again. And he was very confident at that point because he knew that the girls had been shipped west away from the gas chambers, that they would have survived, and found out, well, let me backtrack, let me say it differently. He and Rudy went to the Amsterdam Railroad station daily for a while as trains came back with straggling survivors. The train system was totally broken, and it took a while till the trains went again from Germany to the Netherlands. And so Otto Frank with pictures of Margot and Anne, and Rudy with a picture of his mother, because we knew that his mother was still alive in August of 1944, and we knew this because some of the able Jewish women were actually shipped from Auschwitz to Hamburg to be rubble cleaners. Hamburg had been heavily bombed, and they were used to clean up the rubble of the bombing. And Mrs. Nussbaum was able to, when she heard Dutch around her, to speak to some of the Dutch forced labor and tell them to please let us know that she was still alive. So in August of 1944, we still knew that Rudy's mother was alive. So he was, knowing her toughness, he was kind of confident that she was still alive. So here he was with a picture of his mom, and Otto with pictures of Anne and Margot at the station asking people who came back, have you seen this woman, have you seen these girls? So that's the way these two men bonded. And then when it became clear that Rudy's mother had been liberated by the British, she succumbed to typhus after the war. We never saw her back.
Oh, he never got to see her again. Oh.
And Anna Margot succumbed in March of 1944. But this created a bond between the two men, and I had sort of, in my usual way of trying to be helpful, I had sort of adopted Otto Frank since I knew that his girls didn't come back, so I bought him flowers for his birthday and kept in touch. So it was only natural that he would be our best man when we got married in October of 1947.
And that was in Amsterdam you
that
got
was
married?
In Amsterdam,
yeah.
Yeah. And then another memory which I just used for somebody needed a foreword for a book about Anne Frank. And so Otto Frank, after the secretary, Mipries, had given him all of Anne's manuscripts, he went around to the few friends he had left to ask, shall I or shall I not publish? And so he came to my parents, and I have this is engraved in my mind. I still see him sort of bending forward to shake hands, to say goodbye to my parents, with Anne's writings under his left arm. And my parents, of course, like everybody else, said, yes, it should be published. And eventually he did. Not that my parents were crucial in this matter. They were just...
Right. It was just a memory that you have, though. Yeah. Very significant one. I read somewhere, and I don't know if you want to talk about this, that did she go back and revise some of her diaries?
Well, that's my big shtick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do tell.
Well, after I got my PhD, I actually wrote to Otto Frank and said I would like to examine Anne's diary as a literary piece of writing. And he was quite pleased and said, go right ahead. But he never let me know that there were more than one, that there were two versions. That only came out after his death. He died in 1980 and willed all the papers and writings of Anne to the Dutch Institute of War Documentation. And they put out, I have a copy here, what's called the critical edition, where we have in parallel print Anne's original diary, her rewrite, and underneath what Otto Frank published. And what he published was an amalgam, a mixture of the two versions. Why he made the choices he made.
Were you able to read both versions?
Of course.
Oh, okay.
Of course. That's what I have. I wrote several papers about that.
Do you think it was enhanced? I mean, do you think that it was a better version, the one that ultimately got published, or do you think that there were
Well, I'm a purist, I guess. So what happened was Otto Frank made his amalgam, okay, which is the diary that you know and everybody else knows, the diary on which the film was based and the play was based, you know, the Anne Frank play. And then when the critical edition came out, I got myself a little soapbox and have been preaching from the soapbox ever since that we ought to read what Anne wanted to publish. I thought it was absolutely unfair. Father or not father, you know, and being a child has nothing to do with it. We owe it to her that we read what she wanted to publish.
Yeah, the rewritten version.
And the rewritten version was going to be an epistolary novel, meaning a novel that's based on letters. Her review was extremely astute. She had read copiously and intelligently and had a very good feel of what is literature and what is just blah, 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 blah. My mama was Nazi again and so on and so forth. Why Otto Frank picked the way he did, it's very difficult, but the only explanation I have is that he was much more at ease with his little Anne, who came to her father all the time for help. The young woman, Anne, who between 14 and 15, decided that she was on her own, that she had to take responsibility. That's my main theme, you know. He didn't quite know what to do with her. And so he found it easier, for instance, the relationship with Peter, you know, Anne had really overcome that. She felt that he was, in a way, not up to par, which he wasn't. I knew him. He definitely wasn't. And on the 19th of May of 1944, she says in her spontaneous diary, I put a lock on my heart and Peter will have to use a much stronger crowbar to open it up again. And the next day she starts rewriting. I think that's significant. And concentrating just amazingly on the rewrite. This is from May the 20th, and they were picked up on August the 4th, when they were deported. She rewrote 324 pages with practically no correction, just beautifully written and very astutely. And it's this text which came out last May in Germany, not in the Netherlands because of copyright laws, but in German translation. And I wrote the afterword for this text because it was, in a way, my insistence that this is finally appearing. Now it's going to appear in Spanish, but not in Dutch and not in English. I mean, crazy.
It's not in English? It's not available in English?
Not this edition, no, because of copyright laws, and not in the original Dutch either. You can read it in the critical edition if you go to Perla print, and then there is now another complete edition out done by the Anne Frank Fund in Basel. I'm not sure about the quality of the translation. I haven't really studied it carefully, but it's in small print. They are I don't know. They are loyal to Otto Frank, and they think Otto Frank's edition should be it. They call it the definitive edition, which it isn't. And it's really not right. And in order to make it even more definitive, they had a German woman, a children's author, add a few more little things here and there, tweaking it here, tweaking it there, the definitive edition. They have no right to do that. It's not Anne.
I'm going to do a little research on that. Now my interest is piqued in that.
Yeah,
that's fascinating. I think what's fascinating about that is that she was so meticulous, and she wanted this out there.
She was so knowledgeable and just, I mean, so critical of her own writing and of herself. For instance, there is a little episode, Christmas 1944, when people from the outside, one of the office people and his wife came to visit, and in the original diary, she's sort of a little tearful, sorry for herself. In the final version, she did away with it because she felt, we are so lucky to still be here. Who am I to complain? You know, I mean, it's just a little something, but she left it out. And I think this should be respected, you know.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to take a big leap now, kind of a big turn, that you landed in Portland.
Yes.
How did you get to Portland?
All right. After Rudy got his PhD in physics, nuclear physics, in Amsterdam, University of Amsterdam, in the winter of 1954-55, we started our what in German is called Wanderjahre, years of traveling, postdoc, the typical postdoc. So we uprooted our family several times. We first went to Liverpool, England, from January 55 till summer vacation. Then we spent a year in Bloomington, Indiana. And then we spent a year in Geneva, Switzerland, all in connection with my husband's work. And by that time, we had 3 children. When we were in the United States, we only had 2. And the oldest one, Ralph, has always been very adventurous. He adjusted to English school, he adjusted to American school, he adjusted to French-speaking school. So he was in a way trilingual by the time he was a 3rd grader and did beautifully. His younger brother, Fred, could not handle this. He needed much more quiet. He's a much quieter person, much more introspect. And we knew that Fred needed to go to school in one place and not be uprooted every year. So we knew the time had come to settle down. Anyway, it was very strenuous to move, I think, 9 times in 7 years with a family and all. So Rudy looked for jobs in the United States and got a job offer from the University of California in Davis, which he accepted. And we lived in Davis, California from 1957 to 1959. Davis didn't work out very well for 2 reasons. Number one, the department was very competitive. Rudy was accustomed to a cooperative department, not people competing with each other, And number 2, the climate was just not our climate. Very
It's too beautiful.
Hot. Yeah, Davis is very hot in the summer.
Sunshine day in, day
out.
out.
Yeah, but the price, much too hot for us. So we traveled up and down the West Coast, so to speak, to look for a more congenial climate. And Portland State College at the time was just building up, and they needed faculty, and they happily took a internationally recognized nuclear physicist. So that's why we ended up in Portland. And I lived there for 52 years.
Wow.
And for sentimental purposes, Portland is almost like home city for me, really.
So you enjoyed it
very
much more than UC Davis and
no comparison. No comparison.
Yeah. And you, how old were you when you first landed in Portland?
Well, I was 30 when we moved to this country, so I was 32 when I landed in Portland.
In Portland.
Yeah.
And then at some point, you decided to get your PhD.
Well, I didn't decide that. One thing at a time. Rudy and I had studied physics together in Amsterdam. Physics was never my main interest. I wanted to go into social studies. And he went to one university, a technical university in Delft, and I studied social studies in Amsterdam. And that didn't sit well with him. He felt very lonesome. And I felt I was the only person he had. I should be available. So I said, no, I'm not going to move to Delft. But if he moves back to my family, where he was really accepted as the big son, my parents were just adopted him in many ways. If he moves back to Amsterdam, then I would study physics with him, which is what I did. So for 2 years, we studied physics together. And then in the meantime, we got married. Although we hadn't planned on a family, our oldest son was born a year after we got married. And I felt at that point we didn't have an income. Rudy's uncle and aunt in South Africa, who had no children, and who really had instigated that he would study at a technical university because they wanted him to study chemistry and become a paint chemist. They had a paint factory. And Rudy visited South Africa and said, for heaven's sake, haven't we just gone through racial discrimination? That's not a country where I would want to live and raise a family. So he said, very kind of your uncle and aunt, but I'm not coming to South Africa.
Yeah, very astute.
Yeah, and but they were nice enough to still give him a monthly stipend, even though they knew he would not come to South Africa, which was really wonderful because he could study full time. He didn't have to take jobs. And so, but once our baby was due, I felt that one of us had to have some income because my parents had supported me and his uncle and aunt had supported him, but you don't raise a family on that way. So I worked as an X-ray technician. I worked as a journalist for a while, and then as an X-ray technician. And when the time came to move to the United States, I didn't have a bachelor's degree yet. I had nothing. I had 2 years of university studies. So then I had to make a decision. Do I go back to physics? And that was a no-no. Number one, there were very strong nepotism laws. We would never have found jobs together, in the same department. And number two, it was really not my first love. My first love was social studies. But I looked at the social studies books at the University of California, and I didn't like them one bit. They were like school books, big books with a pre-discussion and a main chapter and then again a summary. That's not the way we studied in Amsterdam. In Amsterdam, we read first-hand sources because we had our education in the Netherlands was finished by the time we finished high school. There was no such thing as general education at the college level. We had to work very hard in high school, but it was done. So and then you started concentrating on your major. And I looked at the social study books. I thought, oh, what a waste of time. I cannot afford it. I have a family. And then I decided, since I had foreign languages sort of in my system, I might as well go into foreign languages. And I majored in German with a minor in French. So I started just on a very part-time basis in Davis, in German and French. And then when we came to Portland, I went to Portland State College and got my bachelor's degree there. And really, before I had my degree, they already wanted me to come and teach German because they were short-handed. But it was quite obvious that with only a bachelor's degree, I was a spare wheel that was rolled in when they needed me and pushed aside when they had enough people. So Rudy had a sabbatical in 1965-66, which we spent here in Seattle. And I took this year to get my master's and got to know the department here. Excellent German department, really excellent.
Where was that? You said that there was an excellent department here?
University of Washington.
Oh, at the UW.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Sorry.
And I did well and I liked the department. Then we went back to Portland in 1966, and I was again the spare wheel. And I knew that I was just as good as everybody else there, but I needed a PhD to prove it. So I did commuting between Portland and Seattle for 10 years.
Oh,
really.
my goodness.
It took forever. Because I had a part-time teaching job at Portland State. I had a family to take care of.
How old were your kids then?
Well, I only did this commuting I started in 1966, 67. The oldest one was off to college. So we only had 2 kids. And Fred would have been 14. And Alka would have been 9. 10.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that was a lot to manage.
Oh, I always had 3 balls in the air. It was really quite something. Yeah.
How did you manage it?
Well, number one, I never drove. I took either the bus or the train, which was at the time $5.95 round trip. Very cheap.
$5.95.
Yeah, right. And so I could I could read on the train. So I would come, say, on a Tuesday morning, I take the morning train and go to a seminar in the afternoon. I found a fellow student whom I met, I think, in the bookstore, I'm not sure. And she asked me what I was going to do after we got our masters together. And I said, well, I would love to finish, get my PhD, but we can't afford for me to leave Portland, and it's just impossible. She said, well, if you need a roof over your head, you can always sleep with me. And so I did. She had a very, very small apartment. So I had my sleeping bag there. And an air mattress. I would roll them out and sleep for one night, and the next day take another seminar and then hurry back to Portland. So 2 seminars per term is all I could take, and it took forever. I finally did my qualifying examinations in 1974, and then it took another 2 years to write my dissertation and be done.
And you were how old when you got your PhD?
Just 50, yeah.
Excellent.
Not quite 50. 76. No, I was 15, 77. So almost 50.
Did you ever think, what am I doing at 50, getting my PhD?
Yes, I felt very, very old, but I enjoyed it, and I knew that I was a good teacher. I had very favorable rapport with my students. In fact, there was I forget what kind of teaching award. I got a teaching award, so I knew I could do it, and I always liked to write, so writing papers was no onerous task. I rather enjoyed it. So it came sort of naturally to me. And I was a little piqued that as long as I didn't have a PhD, I was sort of, shrugged off. They were very unfair because in a way, to be quite honest, for my first and second year students in a way I was a better teacher when I didn't have a PhD, because all I did was concentrate on them. And when I was washing dishes or whatever, I was thinking of my next class. Once had a PhD, I had to think of the papers I had to write. In a way, you take it, you take more away from your students than to satisfy what was necessary.
How long did you teach then?
I taught a regular job in 1978. And I managed within 10 years to climb all the ranks from assistant professor to associate professor to full professor. So I retired as a full professor.
And how long ago was that you retired?
Well, again, that's more complicated than meets the eye. I retired actually at age 61, which was way too early. I would have loved to teach for a few more years because I enjoyed the interaction with the students. But Rudy is 5 years older. He retired at the end of 1987. And we tried it for 1 year. He retired, and I'm teaching full time. And it was very hard. And I just felt he was cheated out of his young life by being in hiding, in the critical years. Should I cheat him out of traveling together and having a good time? And I didn't have the heart to do that. So I gave up teaching, but did a lot of academic writing still afterwards. I wrote about half of my 50 papers after I retired.
And how long ago did he pass away?
He passed away in the summer of 2011.
So
it's almost 9 years now.
9 years.
Yeah.
Did you have a lot of time to travel together?
Oh, yes. We traveled a lot. We lived in New Zealand for a while, which was nice. So we traveled the Pacific Rim. That was our biggest. And we went to Europe every year while my mother was still alive. She died in 1995. And ever since, we went every other year. So, yes, we traveled. We had a great time. And enjoyed it greatly.
So the past 9 years you've had on your own. You had told me earlier that your daughter had passed away.
Yeah, Elka died in 2007.
2007. So you have been with your 2 children here since then, and really kind of independent.
Oh yeah,
and responsible for yourself. Mm-hmm. How has that been for you?
Well, you have to be challenged in order to deploy all that's in you. I noticed that before. I traveled to Europe a few times while we were married on my own because I wanted to take care of my mother or because I had to give a paper. And I always found traveling by myself very different from traveling with my husband, but rewarding in its own way. Because I feel when you travel by yourself, you are much more open to what's happening around you. When you have a sounding board, you keep reinforcing your own prejudices and each other's prejudices. She's the person who blah, 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 blah. Well, if she's the only person I relate to, I am more open to her, and I will not put her in a framework, but rather listen and watch out. So I have always felt that, although I never ever regretted marrying Rudy, it was a wonderful and very, very good marriage, I always felt that there's some things within myself that come out more strongly when I'm by myself because I'm depending on my own devices, so to speak.
So a sense of freedom.
Yeah, a sense of freedom, that's probably it. A sense of leaving things open, not prejudging, being open. I think that's probably more. I don't feel it as freedom, but I feel it as being vulnerable and being open.
In a very good way. Vulnerable in a good way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think that a lot of people find themselves maybe in your same position as a widow, and they don't stay so active and they don't stay so engaged with life. But you have managed to do that.
Well, I think I don't think about it very much. I'm just doing it.
Yeah, again, it's in your DNA.
Yeah, right.
Like you said earlier. But I did love what you said earlier. You said you have to stay challenged in order to deploy, what's in you, right? And I think that's very true. That we have to stay. We have to stretch ourselves in order to grow. Yeah. Because otherwise, we just wither, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you've managed to do that well. Yeah. How long were you working on your book?
Well, that was a longer process than I anticipated.
It always is.
I have edited one book before, but I don't consider myself a writer, although I like to write. I don't want to be a writer. That's not my aspiration. But this man, Karl Mayer, was so special. And when I learned that somebody in Germany was writing a biography about him, I got very interested. And Rudy and I met the author, and his book, Ye Big, was untranslatable.
Yeah, quite thick, an inch and a half, 2 inches. Yeah.
And very much into German leftist politics, which I like. Not a leftistness that I don't like, but impossible to translate for American readers. So I urged him at the time, Mr. Niebaum is his name, Peter Niebaum. I urged him to write something more compact that I could translate, because I felt that Karl May should be known beyond Germany. And he obliged. He wrote a smaller book. And I started translating it in 2013. And the more I translated, the more I realized that it's still not a book that's going to sell in this country. It's still too much predicated on things that are important to progressive Germans, but not necessarily to the reading public in this country. So, but I finished translating it and then tried to find a publisher, which is an arduous process, no fun at all. And when I noticed that it didn't work, I went to advice to my friend Ursula Le Guin. You know who she is, I guess.
Who is that?
Ursula Le Guin.
No, actually, I don't.
You don't know Ursula Le Guin?
No.
Oh my goodness, she was a very famous Portland writer.
Oh no, I don't know her. No,
that's amazing, because she's known internationally. Anyway, and Ursula, who had read some other writings, personal writings I had done for the family, said you should mix in your own story. It's such an interesting story. Human interest always sells, you know. And I said, who wants to do that? And she said, do it. And somebody else who had read my manuscript and who knew my background said, do it. So I finally minded their advice and started writing my own story. I also found myself season editor in Portland and asked her to help me pare down what I had translated. And she did. So my book reads Laureen Nussbaum with Karen Kirtley. So Karen helped cut down Niebaum's translation, or my translation of Niebaum's text. And I had a great time writing my own story in between. And so we tried to weld these two together and succeeded to a certain extent, but there were still sharp edges, you know, a chapter about him, a chapter about him. And so when I offered the manuscript to feminist press, She Writes. Are you aware of them? She Writes.
Oh, yes, I am. Yeah.
Okay. Because another friend of mine, a writer friend, had published her a novel at She Writes, and she said that's the right one to approach, and I did. And they were interested, but they needed some, what is it called? They suggested an editor who was a very fine person. Of course, I had to pay for all that. Has been a very costly enterprise, but she did a very nice job. She softened the edges and helped me interweave. Then it became, I thought, a pretty nice manuscript. So,
what was the writing process like for you? Was it difficult, not just to sit down and write for, I don't know, an hour or two every day, but just to go back in time and have to...
That doesn't bother me.
It doesn't bother you. No, so no. Conversations like this they don't bother you. And you had mentioned to me earlier before we started recording that you have a bunch of speaking engagements that are lined up where in the near future where you'll just be talking about this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's at universities as well as at in libraries all over the place. No, that doesn't bother me.
Mm. Your story is very touching. I've read works by Jewish authors, and of course, you learn in history, and you learn in school, and you see movies. But to sit down with someone who lived through that time is very touching. So I really appreciate it. Really appreciate it.
Welcome.
I have just a couple other questions for you. Do you consider yourself Jewish? Are you a practicing Jew?
So people even ask me, how do you feel about abandoning? Well, I'm part German, part Dutch, part Jewish. I'm a composite, and I'm quite comfortable with it.
And you don't feel compelled to be one way or the other?
No. In this house, we have quite a number of Jewish residents, and they do Passover and they do Hanukkah. And once in a while, I join because I have good memories of my father did a beautiful Seder at Passover, and I I sort of think of him, when we do that. And Hanukkah, sometimes we did at home, sometimes we didn't. At a time when we lived above my grandmother, we would have Hanukkah upstairs and Christmas downstairs. So we are...
the best of both worlds.
Yeah, right, that's right. If we see the good wherever it's good, and try to do something the bad against the bad wherever we can.
Well, speaking of that, brings me to another question, just in terms of what is happening in the world today. Particularly, I'll just say it outright, particularly with our president and the fact that he's given kind of the green light for a lot of bad behavior and a bad activity to take place. How do you view that? And is there anything that you do to counteract that? And then is there anything that you would suggest other people could do to kind of counteract that?
Well, we have to backtrack a little bit. However indignant and furious I am about Trump, he didn't come out of nowhere. I think this country has been going the wrong way ever since the Vietnam War. Maybe even the Korean War, but I didn't live in this country during the Korean War, but I know about the Vietnam War. This is old, horrible imperialism, and that's wrong. And by trying to soft pedal it, whether it is in Afghanistan or in the Middle East, it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong. We are killing people, we are on the wrong track. So I'm very indignant about it, and I've always been a member of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and used to leaflet and to be present and try to do what little bit I can. So I think we should protest. I think we should voice our indignation. I don't think it's going to be very easy, because I think the world has been going the wrong way, quite frankly.
The world or the U.S.?
The U.S. needed it least of all, and with the U.S. succumbing to rightist nationalism, where do we turn? I mean, Europe is every bit as bad right now. It's awful. And so I feel very, I can't say guilty, but ashamed when I think of the people who died in concentration camps, and whose cry I really feel very strongly is, make sure it won't happen again. It's happening right now. I mean, children in cages, and it's awful. And I am really, I usually smile, I'm usually positive, but I'm really deep down quite desperate about the human situation. And I think the only way I can live is by being upbeat and being helpful and making the best of every day. That's the only thing I can do. But the situation is very dismal. And so I end my book with a political 2 pages. And just the other day I was asked, there's a Anne Frank magazine put out. I don't know who really puts it out, but the author, the editor, told me that the 3 magazines are going to be published by Simon & Schuster, no less, a big publishing house. Would I please write a foreword? And so I did last Tuesday. I just sat down and wrote it in one way, and I end up very political too. I mean, telling people that how ashamed I am, and how we had really pledged ourselves to make sure it wouldn't happen again. And the illusions we had about the United Nations, they would make sure that it wouldn't happen again. And it's really quite awful.
Yeah, we are very complacent.
Yeah,
as a society.
If you pardon my political preferences, I mean, the way Bernie Sanders is being torn down by the Democrats, it's awful. He is one person who really wants to make some radical change, which is so badly needed. And he's being torn down by...
Well, the political system, that's a whole nother conversation, but the political system is atrocious. And
instead of the Democrats having a decent platform that we all of us can subscribe to, there's bickering between.
It is terrible.
Yeah.
So your book, Shedding Our Stars, the story of Hans Kallmeyer and how he saved thousands of families like mine, is available. I'll link to that in the show notes so people can pick up a copy of that. Is there any other place where people can find you or find out more information about you? Or, I mean, usually I'll ask my guests, like, what are your social media handles? And are you on Twitter? And I just suspect that you're not. I hope that you're not.
I'm not, but there is a very decent and up-to-date entry in Wikipedia.
Great. Okay.
So you can find me Wikipedia.
Okay,
Yeah.
excellent. Let me just ask, is there anything else that we haven't covered that you would like to add or talk about today?
No, I think I got my little soapbox in.
Yeah, good. So you got soapbox check and your history, which is pretty phenomenal. So we've covered that. I do like to ask guests before we wrap up one last question, and that is, what does it mean to you to be bold?
I don't know. I don't really think about the concept bold very much, but the opposite. I never wanted to be sissy. Being sissy for me was just an absolute no-no. I mentioned that I was a tomboy, kind of boyish. So to be sissy is just, when I see a doctor, when a procedure has to be done, I'm not sissy, Whether that's bold, I don't know. But
I think that might be the best answer yet I've ever had from someone. It's going the other way, not to be a sissy. I love that. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. And thanks again so much for having me here and sitting down and spending so much time talking and telling your history, because I'm honored and just really appreciate it.
Yeah, good.
I'd love to hear your feedback about this conversation. What are you going through? How are you dealing with everything? Did this resonate with you? Was it helpful to you? Laureen's book is Shedding Our Stars, the story of Hans Kallmeyer and how he saved thousands of families like mine. You can pick up a copy of that wherever you find your books, and I highly recommend ordering it through your local bookstore so we can support small businesses, which are really struggling right now. If you'd like to support the show and let me know how much you are inspired by these conversations and how much you look forward to hearing the uplifting stories from my guests, go to patreon.com/bebold. Patreon supporters get to submit questions for me to ask guests and become part of our private Facebook group, and that is ladies only. They also get access to bonus content, including questions I ask of the guests. Of course, there are other ways to support the show. You can leave feedback on whatever podcast app you're using to listen to these episodes. And please, please, please make sure you're subscribed. That actually helps me show up higher in search results. And also share these episodes with friends. The number one way people find out about podcasts is word of mouth. To keep up with me and my adventures, you can connect with me by friending me on Facebook, and I'm on Instagram at BethWhitwa, BethWhitwa, and Wandergal. Feel free to leave a message or question at 877-280-5170. I do love feedback. I really, really do. So please take a moment to let me know what you think. You can also email me at beth@shesboldpodcast.com. Ladies, don't forget to join the Be Bold Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Be Bold group for support and encouragement for whatever ways you're trying to be bold. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the She's Bold podcast. Until next time, be bold.